today in our series on church history, covering persecution in the early church. I said that the series is going basically from 60 to 600 AD, but persecution is really focused on the first half of that. The reason being, in 313 AD, when Emperor Constantine, he's been a Christian for a year, 312 he converts, he legalizes Christianity, and it ceases to be persecuted in the same way in the Roman Empire. And it remains legal for as long as there's a Roman Empire, for sure. Rome falls in 410, but that's really only in the West. You heard about the Byzantine Empire? Well, they didn't think of themselves as the Byzantine Empire. They thought of themselves as the Roman Empire. They didn't know that they were destroyed in 410. That was just a city. So, Christianity ceases to be persecuted in quite the same way for a long time. And in our period, for all intents and purposes, we're just going to cover the first half when it comes to persecution. There does come later, and this continues to the present day, when Islam comes on the scene in the 7th century, then there's a new kind of persecution. We're not going to learn about that today. Had a bit of a weird week, so I will be kind of ad-libbing all of this today. We'll see what we end up covering. But there's a few things that I hope we understand. Basically, as we talk about persecution in the early church, what I want you to see is that persecution was not the same everywhere all the time. It's always been sporadic. It's always been geographically diverse. There's never been a time where every church has suffered the same way. And even every Christian, they suffer differently. When within a church that's suffering, the different people are going to suffer differently. The reason I want you to understand this is I worry that as we think about persecution today, we think that was something back then, not something now. It is something now. It's not something in swift current. But did you know that the number of martyrs in the last century was more than double every other century combined in the church? And if you think it's stopped because now we're in the 21st century, from what I can find online, and you'll have to forgive me, I'm not an analyst, in 2020, 8 Christians were martyred every day, on average. During COVID, it doubled. 2022, it was 16 Christians per day. But it's not like it's some kind of rapid growth trend where it's just getting worse and worse and worse. You know, COVID's over now. It's settled down to 11 or 13 a day, or last year. Those were huge increases from years prior as well. You can go online and find reviews, reports done on every country. They rank countries by how heavy the persecution is. From 2019 to 2020, the number of Christians they measured to be severely persecuted went up from 280 million to 360 million. Just crazy increases. And you can read about the things going on in China. North Korea is some of the worst. Read about Nigeria. That's where it seems most of the martyrdoms are actually taking place. I don't want us to think persecution is a thing of the past. It's always been some here, some there, some now, some then. I also don't want us to think that it's always an obvious reason, because we'll talk about persecution came first from the Jews and then by the Greeks, and for different reasons. And throughout the centuries, Satan has come up with different reasons to give people to hurt Christians. I wouldn't want anyone to think, well, they say they're persecuting me because I'm bigoted and mean. Therefore, it's not because I'm a Christian. No, Satan doesn't want to make the world look as bad as they possibly can. He comes as an angel of light. They'll come up with all kinds of reasons. And Jesus even said, the time is coming when men will think they're doing service to God by persecuting you. So, Those are the things I hope we learn. What we're going to cover is basically why the church was persecuted from the world's perspective. We know from Jesus' perspective, it's because the devil hates Jesus, and the world hated him, and they'll hate you also. We also know from God's perspective, it's for our good. Jesus learned obedience through what he suffered. Therefore, we, as obedient children, are learning because we have a loving Father who disciplines his children. I want to give you the world's reasons so that you see the world's reasons are always changing. And then we'll look at a few examples and how the church dealt with this in that time. Before we start, are there concerns we want to raise from previous lessons? The earliest persecution in the church, you know the reasons, because they're recorded in Acts. They're recorded in the epistles. You know that very early on, the majority of the persecution against the church came from the Jews. It came from Pharisees primarily, who persecuted the church for much the same reason they persecuted Jesus. Some of it was jealousy. The people were listening to the apostles and not to the Pharisees. In Deuteronomy, for example, God tells them, you will appoint a place where when they have a dispute, they'll go to it, right? If any case arises within your towns that's too difficult for you, you take it to the priest who stands to minister before God and to the judge who's in office in those days. And it's the appointed place, Jerusalem. This would be the Sanhedrin in the time of Christ. But when a dispute arises in Acts 15, what do? They go to the appointed place and they meet with the apostles and the elders. Jerusalem is becoming a city that takes care of the orphans and widows. James the Just, he's called, renowned even outside the scriptures. You know, you read about the Bishop James in Jerusalem, and you get the sense he's a wonderful guy. But outside the Bible, you can read a bit more about him. And he was so widely respected that even Josephus, who's a Jewish historian, not a Christian, he says that the reason Jerusalem was destroyed, one of them, they killed James the Just. They had no right to do that. He was an honorable man who did nothing but good for the people. Under his bishopric, Jerusalem became a city like Isaiah promised, that was filled with righteousness, that cared for the orphans and widows, where true religion was. So it's jealousy. It's also zeal for the law. Now, Paul says in Romans 9, I testify concerning them. They have a zeal, but not according to knowledge. Not knowing the righteousness of God, they try to establish righteousness of their own. And he says that he spent his whole life, 2 Timothy 1, in good conscience. What do you mean in good conscience? You were persecuting the church, Paul. How did you have a good conscience? It's because he believed, as Jesus said they would believe, he was doing service to God. What does the law say you do with idolaters? Stone them. And if anyone's teaching others to follow false gods, definitely stone them. The Torah says that God will raise up false prophets to say, follow these other gods. And when they do, if they tell you to follow anyone but Yahweh, you stone them. From Paul's perspective, that's what the apostles were doing. Who's this Jesus guy? You think we should worship him and not the Lord who saved us up out of Egypt? He did it in good conscience, in ignorance, he says. So some of it's zeal. Paul says it's real zeal. Zeal in good conscience. Some of it's just jealousy. Some of it's just bitterness. But for the first few decades, the majority of persecution comes from the Jews and to the Jews. Insofar as it's zeal for the law, they don't give a hoot what the Gentiles do, because they've got this deal with the Romans, the Pax Romana. Rome spread a lot of places, and everywhere they went, most people were quite content to adopt their religion and adopt it into their own religion. And so there was just this religious sharing. If Rome takes over, say, the Celts, well, the Celts will now share their religion with the Romans, and the Romans will share their religion with the Celts, and some gods get new names, and some gods are just added to the pantheon. And the religion just keeps growing and growing and growing as Rome spreads its borders militarily. It didn't work with the Jews. They found that whenever they tried to get the Jews to assimilate into their culture, it ended violently. And so they had this deal. As long as you don't try to convert anybody, we'll leave you be. You'll get a special pass to do your own thing religiously, and we just won't bug you about it. Then Paul comes on the scene, and people like Paul, and Eusebius tells us most of the disciples go about everywhere trying to make as many converts as they possibly can. In the beginning, it is not clear that Christianity is anything other than a sect of Judaism. You remember in Acts, they go to the, when Paul's on trial, he's a Jew being accused by other Jews with matters pertaining to their law. Christianity is not seen as a new religion. It's seen as an inner Judaism dispute. Jews disagreeing about what the law means. And the Romans feel like, we don't care what you do with your law. But once you Jews start breaking our law and trying to convert people, we're going to bring judgment down on all of you. Indiscriminately. We don't care. We're not going to do the investigation to figure out which one of you follow this interpretation of the law and which ones do that. That's why they're so scared when Jesus walks in, rides on to Jerusalem in a donkey, right? You know Zechariah 9? Your king is coming to you on a donkey. What's the rest of the chapter about? Every other line in the chapter is about how the Messiah has military victory over all the nations. And so for him to ride in on a donkey, they're like, oh no. He's going to declare war on Rome, and we do not want to be crushed in that bloodbath. So the first bit of persecution comes from the Jews. For them, it's religious. Some of it's personal, jealousy. But it doesn't remain from the Jews. And it doesn't remain only to the Jews. Even in the time of Acts, what are some reasons Gentiles are persecuted? They're persecuted at Thessalonica. What would be some reasons? You don't have to stick to Thessalonica. Anywhere Gentiles are persecuted will do. How do the idol makers feel about Christianity? Putting us out of business.
Yeah. What's his name?
They have that big chant in the streets. Great is Artemis of the Ephesians.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Just keep chanting it. So Gentiles are persecuted early on, but for the most part, until you get to about 60 AD, persecution is coming from the Jews. But it doesn't stay that way. And in fact, by the middle of the 2nd century, persecution from the Jews has stopped. Around 132, 135 AD, the Jews have hurrah, hardly a hurrah. They've got a rebellion. Their history is full of rebellions. They met Rome for the first time in 161 BC. Their whole history has been rebellion here, rebellion there. But 132, 135, a false messiah going by the name of Bar Kokhba, meaning son of a star. Later on, they'll call him Bar Kokhba, son of falsehood. More descriptive title, as they realized in hindsight, because he said he was the Messiah. He said he'd give them victory over the Romans. You can imagine what actually happened. So far from restoring Jerusalem, he got so many people killed. The Christians wouldn't follow him, because of course Jesus told them, if anyone says he's the Messiah, don't listen, obviously. I'm the Messiah. You'll know when I get here. It'll be like lightning from one end of the heaven to the other. That ruined. After that, Christians and Jews were not seen by anyone as two strands of something. They were different things. And the Jews wouldn't have it. This is already true in Hebrews. It's true by the time John is written. People are being desynagogued for following Jesus. If you're a Jew and you follow Jesus, often you do it at risk of losing your family. But that depended on the family. Because you might get a family that's a little more tolerant and a little more hopeful. Or you might get a family that's like, no, we're done with you. After this last rebellion, where the Christians don't help and they leave their countrymen to die because they won't follow a false Messiah, they're seen as unpatriotic, they're seen as traitors, and they'll have nothing to do with each other from then on. From then on, all the persecution is going to come from Rome. Before that point, just to give you an overview of how this goes, it is sporadic in that intense persecution comes in waves, but not that often. Older historians used to say there were 10 waves of persecution. That was based on, well, there's 10 plagues in Exodus, and there's 10 kingdoms or what have you in Revelation, 10 horns of the beast. Problem is, those 10, if you're going to count every local persecution, there's way more than 10. And if you're going to cover the ones that are empire-wide, well, there's really only 2. So 10's a nice number, but we're going to talk about the 2 that matter and maybe some others. And also the 2 that come first within the Bible times. So there's 2 in the Bible times. One is 61 to 64 roundabouts. That's Nero. It's not everywhere, but it's important because it's where Paul and Peter died. And because it is coming from Rome. Domitian, now we're in the 90s. This is when John is exiled to Patmos. Domitian would have everybody worship the emperor. And that's not new. Rome's been worshiping the emperor for a long time. But he pushes it. And a lot of Christians die. So you get those early on persecutions that you want to know about because they're biblical. They take place within the Bible's context. You want to know that before Jerusalem's destroyed, you've got Christians being martyred as far away as Rome. Gospel spreading fast. You want to know that emperor worship was being pushed by Domitian when you read Revelation and you read about the mark of the beast and you read about the markets. Because to the people reading this at first, this would not be it wouldn't just be a future thing. It would be, oh, we know what that's like. That just happened. Like just the other day. We all remember. He's painting the future in terms of the recent past. But there's 2 persecutions that come from Rome that are quite empire-wide. One is from Decius Trajan, 249-ish, 250 AD. It's the first one that is empire-wide. Up until that point, the church has already been going for 220 years. All of the persecution that it's encountered in the time of the apostles and who we call the apostolic fathers, all of it has been local, temporal. For example, in Lyon, 177, they have Christians are dragged into the streets. Christians had slaves back then, don't get too offended. But if you were a slave of a Christian master, they tortured you until you admitted that your master had committed all kinds of awful crimes. You know it's really easy to believe awful things about someone you already don't like? Notice that? People didn't like the Christians. They were suspicious of them. They were antisocial. They wouldn't go to birthday parties because the birthday parties were wound up with pagan religion. They were against abortion. They had that made them morally superior. Back then, let's not be anachronistic. Let's not read in the present. Abortion had nothing to do with the woman's choice. Everything to do with the man's choice. The man says you've got to kill the kid. What are you going to do? You're a woman in Roman society. There's nothing he can do what he wants. It's all about his choice. I don't know if they had, there's debate, and I'm not a real scholar, so I don't know whether they had the pill back then. It looks like they did. But certainly, they would leave the baby in the woods. And so what the church would do is they would go into the woods, and they would gather the babies and raise them. And they would pool their funds, just as we pool our funds today, and primarily spend them on looking after the orphans and widows, and burying the dead. They would spend them on caring for the people. And it's like they're beating Rome at their own game. You know, Rome's supposed to be taking care of their people. They're the government, and Christians are doing such a better job. So there's hatred there. There's suspicion. And to add to the suspicion, I mean, they're calling each other brother, sister. This guy says sister. I mean, that's your wife. If you married your sister, what's going on here? We still use that language. We don't use it all the time. But you can tell from Paul's letters when he always calls them brother. There was an intentionality to it because we've been grafted into a family. And so they're always calling each other brother, sister. And it's like, what's going on here? And then they have the Lord's Supper where they eat the flesh and blood of their Lord. If you already don't like this big group, you can imagine it was not difficult for rumors to circulate about incest and cannibalism. And you can read a lot of the apologists from that time. Justin Martyr's the most famous, but Tertullian, there's others. They all argue, we're not cannibals. There's no incest. All we do is we're good citizens who are, more upstanding citizens than everybody else. Stop persecuting us for no reason. It was not hard for rumors to spread. So anyway, in Lyon, they take the slaves, they torture them until they admit that their masters are cannibals and incestuous and all this stuff. And then the Christians are taken in the streets and killed. But that doesn't last long. 3 years later, the Bishop of Lyon writes a 5-volume work on the pressing issue of the day. What do you think it would be? All this persecution. What do you think he writes about? Gnosticism. 5 volumes, Adversus Heresus, against heresies. Very important work. But you see what I mean? There's persecution here, persecution there. Sometimes, to give you a sense of it, for Trajan, it's fairly early on, between like the 90s and the early 2nd century. Pliny writes him a letter. Pliny's a Roman official who has to deal with Christians. And people are accused of being Christians, and he writes to Trajan and says, they're accused of being Christians, but technically, I can't tell that they've committed any crimes other than being a Christian. What should I do with this? What kind of policy should I use to decide what I do if someone's accused of being a Christian? And Trajan answered, and his answer became the policy for a long time. Well, don't seek out Christians. Don't waste government resources. But if somebody's accused of being a Christian, then you can go against them with the law. You can kill them, put them in prison, what have you. Back then, you wouldn't put people in prison for long because you just decide what to do with them so they're not there. For many in the church, this seemed terribly unjust because you're treating us as criminals when we're accused, but you don't seek us out because we're not actually criminals. We haven't done anything wrong. From the government's perspective, it was just, this is the most pragmatic, cheapest way of dealing with this problem. But, so you get, for example, 107, 110 roundabouts, Ignatius. He's a significant figure for a number of reasons, but for our purposes, just to say, he's accused of being a Christian, and then he's taken to Rome to be executed. But he's the only one who's been accused. So, while he's on the way, he can meet with a friend and write letters to all the churches. And Christians can come visit him. And for a whole bunch of time, Christians would be accused of being Christians, and they'd be put in prison and to decide what to do with them while they're in prison, awaiting death. Other Christians would come and pray with them. Because it's only illegal to be a Christian and to pray to God if somebody accuses you. All that to say, until 250, persecution's been like that. You might have, maybe your pastor will get arrested. Maybe somebody in your church gets arrested. Maybe you go 50 years, nobody gets arrested. Maybe you get a governor who just hates you Why? Well, the last governor didn't. I don't want to be like him. Septimus Severus, he was very kind to Christians. He was an emperor in the early 3rd century, before Decius. And he was so friendly towards Christians, he had a bust of Abraham and of Jesus put up in his pantheon. It said he had the golden rule inscribed on a plate unto others. So, of course, the next guy has to persecute Christians, because you don't want to be like that guy. It's got nothing to do with the church. So you see what I mean? Persecution can come for all kinds of reasons. It can be because they believe awful things about you. They've just been told. It can be because they just like seeing people torn apart by lions. It can be because they just don't want to be like the other guy. Now it's like, this has nothing to do with anything. It feels like a ripoff, you know? I want to suffer for Christ, not because Plotinus didn't like Severus. What's that got to do with anything? But it's easier for us in hindsight to look at this and go, clearly, God was with his people. God was worked it out so that, according to his promise, the church was suffered and hated. In the moment, sometimes, if the church is suffering, it feels like it's random, and it isn't because of Jesus. Maybe it's our fault. Or maybe we're suffering for doing evil, not for doing good. In hindsight, we can look at this a little more clearly and see, no, they were suffering for Christ. But in 250, now you've got empire-wide persecution, everyone, everywhere. But only for a couple of years. It goes on about 10 years, depending where you are, only a couple of years in other places. And then you get 40 years of peace, because you get a guy who just is very kind. Then you get another, this is the worst one, in 303, Diocletian, who's been kind to everybody up to this point, but he's got a guy working for him who's like, you should be meaner to Christians. And you go, okay, sure. He puts out 3 edicts. All Christian literature should be burned. All Bibles. All Christian buildings are destroyed. If you're in any foreign government, you lose your job. If you're a Christian, I mean. And then the next year, he releases another edict that is the worst of them all. Every person in the empire, this probably wasn't carried out fully in the full empire. They didn't have TV back then, the internet for communications. So this is the decree. Every person in the empire must offer incense to the gods or die. Now you can imagine, how many people do you think are affected negatively by this law? There's only one group that cares, Christians. And that's the point of the law. That's just 10 years before Christianity is legalized for basically forever. It was there were 2, and this was the last persecution of the entire church. And since then, as far as I'm aware, there hasn't been another one like it. The persecution has continued since that time to be sporadic and local. Questions so far? How are we doing?
There was the time when they were lighting Christians on fire or for streetlights.
The famous story, that was Nero's gardens. So that would be around 61, 64. That would be shortly before Peter and Paul died. So they might have been known about that and to comfort people. Probably they were there, not at the party, but
yeah, witnessed it.
Nero, that was, and like I say, persecution comes for so many reasons. That reason was because Nero was sadistic. Kicks his own wife to death. Poisons his own brother. Just pure evil. The Roman, and Tacitus was not a Christian. The Roman historian Tacitus, he suggested that probably Nero set Rome on fire and then blamed the Christians for it. I don't know that they had any real evidence that Nero did it, other than Christians wouldn't, and Nero blamed them. We all know what Nero's like. He just had the kind of character that his own people thought, yeah, he would probably set his own city on fire to kill us.
Chances are.
Yeah, just for fun.
Mm-hmm.
How did they deal with this at the time? I want to give you two stories. First, there's a fellow named Quintus Phrygia. If you want to read about him, there was an encyclical letter sent out by one of the churches at the time. They wanted to share the martyrdom of Polycarp with everybody. They wanted the people in the church to be encouraged by the faith displayed by Polycarp. Now, Polycarp, I think I said last week, was a disciple of John himself. And he was a Christian for a long time. 86 years. I don't know how old he was when he was saved, but he was a Christian for 86 years. This was around very early 2nd century anyhow, that he dies. And so it's around the time that if you're accused, you're guilty. But if you're not accused, it's fine. So he was accused, and he knew that the soldiers were coming. People told him to run. He didn't. The soldiers came to get him. They give him the chance. You can just repent of this whole Christianity thing, and we won't have to take you away to kill you. And he said, no. I've served my Lord for 86 years. He's never failed me. I'm not going to fail him now. As they're on the way, he just asks permission to pray for them and to pray for the people. And he prays for everybody. And he prays in such a way. You ever hear someone pray who's prayed for 86 years? They just have a way of praying that you can see their sincerity. You can hear their love for all the people, and it comes out. He prays and prays and prays for hours and hours. And by the time he's done praying, he's praying for the soldiers have a real sense by now of what kind of person this is. Soldiers, do we really have to kill this guy? They take him to Smyrna. And he's put before I forget the official title of whoever's judging him. But he's given the chance, all you got to do to repent, we're going to throw you to the lions. The crowds are all waiting. They want him to be thrown to the lions. All you got to do is say death to the atheists, which of course is the Christians. They're the only people who don't have a God you can see. The only ones who don't believe in the Roman pantheon, the atheists. And he looks out at the crowd waiting for him to die, and he says, death to the atheists. Talking about them. The real atheists who deny the true God. Of course, this doesn't go well for him. So he's thrown to the lions. And the lions aren't willing to eat him. The lions serve God even if the Romans won't. So the story goes, and they end up having to burn him. First, the fire won't kill him either. As the story goes, there's some details I'm not sure are interpolations or what. Apparently his body glowed like bread or something like that. Church held on to his bones. I want you to get from this story, the church had a deep admiration for the martyrs, for the faith that endured to the end through terrible sufferings. They had an admiration. I want to consider, well, I won't turn there, but you know Hebrews 11, Hebrews 12. Hebrews 12, 1 to 3, therefore being surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses. What's the cloud of witnesses? He's just given you a whole chapter of chapter 11 of people who believed without seeing, people who suffered for their faith. That cloud has grown, and the attitude of the church is, we are surrounded by witnesses. We want to share that witness with the church as a way of building them up. They would gather. They would celebrate. This still goes on in the Catholic Church. We've kind of dropped it. But they would celebrate the death of the saints as their birthdays in heaven. And they would have these feast days, and they would hold on to the bones as relics. It's hard to say how early on relics became very superstitious, but the idea was very biblical at the first. We want to be surrounded by a cloud of witnesses. We want the church to be constantly built up by the faith of the saints. We want, like Paul says, I want to come to you and impart to you some spiritual gift, Romans 1. That is, that we might be mutually encouraged by one another's faith. And so the church sent this letter around about Polycarp, and there were hundreds like him, maybe thousands. You couldn't count how many people died for Jesus. But whether it was a great figure, Polycarp was well known in the church, or a lesser, not lesser, but just someone no one's ever heard of. Some young woman and her mother were boiled in pitch, and the guard who had to do it saw their faith and how they endured to the end, and he became a Christian. It says that the woman appeared to him in a dream and gave him the martyr's crown. Shortly after, he was beheaded for his faith. You get stories like that abound. So on the one hand, the church had everywhere they adopted this attitude of, we rejoice, be counted worthy, partake in the sufferings of Christ. Let's check what time it is. This attitude, though, this might surprise you. You might think I'm exaggerating, and, the common man was a little more scared. And to be sure, there were people who were scared. When Decius came, when Diocletian came, when these empire-wide persecutions came, where they weren't just coming after people they accused, but they're coming after everyone, a huge number of people left the church. So many people that when the persecutions ended, the church had massive debates. Well, what do you do with someone who denied Christ? Because Jesus said, if you deny me before men, I'll deny you before the Father. Now that there's no persecution, they think they could just waltz back into the church like nothing happened. No worries. It was a huge debate. So there were people like that. But often the problem that the church had to address was actually the opposite. So we come to Quintus of Phrygia. He's an example. There are many like him. He went to the Roman authorities, time of persecution, and said, I'm a Christian. Remember, if you're not accused, you don't have to die. He goes and he says, I turn in myself, I'm a Christian. And so they torture him and ask him to recant, and he does. The church also spread this story. They attached it to the story of Polycarp because they wanted the church to have a balance. They wanted the church to see, on the one hand, the faith of the martyrs is absolutely beautiful. And the death of God's chosen people is precious to us. You should aspire to their faith. On the other hand, just because you have fanatical zeal and you think that you have the faith to endure to the end, that doesn't mean you do. And you don't have the right. Jesus said, if they persecute you in one town, what? Turn yourself in. No, you're right, flee. Go to the next town over. You won't get through all the towns. And there were people so zealous for martyrdom, they were throwing themselves at the swords and the lions. And the church had to say, you are not helping our cause here. Especially if you give in afterwards and then just give up on Jesus. I think that's a lesson we need today too. Fanaticism is not, just because you think you can expose yourself to danger because you have faith and you're not a coward, doesn't mean you actually have faith. You might actually be a coward. I know people, and you'll see them on the internet, that they will call out every sin in the culture. This was true back then, when the government would say Christians have to die. There would be Christians who'd stand up and say, God will judge you. You put up a poster saying Christians should die, I'll tear it down and rip it up in front of the police station. You get people today who will call out every sin. They're against everything the world does. And I mean, rightly so. The world's pretty awful. And you think, maybe these people, if the government does decide to crack down on Christians in Canada, maybe they'll be some of the first to go. The fact that they've been outspoken is no guarantee that they will have faith when it comes time to actually suffer. So, to conclude, gone over a lot of random stuff all over the map. But what I hope you get is persecution comes for all kinds of reasons. Persecution comes in one spot, another spot. Remember, Hebrews says to pray for those in prison as though present with them. Because you're members of the same body. I don't want to tell you, there's this cliche where pastors say, persecution might come, we've got to be ready. Oh yeah, it might come, we've got to be ready. But more importantly, persecution is a reality that the church around the world has to deal with. And we are part of that church, just like they were then in the early church. Sometimes persecution means you die. Sometimes it means somebody else dies near you. Remember in Revelation, Jesus says, I know where you dwell, where Satan's throne is, and how you held my name, and you held the faith, even in the days of Antipas, my faithful servant who was killed among you, where Satan dwells. Revelation 2:13. Jesus admires their faith, not because they endured unto death, but because they endured when their friend died. That's persecution too. So persecutions always come for lots of reasons, lots of places, lots of times. Little bit, a lot of it. It changes. It's never been a consistent thing. I wouldn't want you to think we're not going under persecution until this or that happens. The church is going through persecution. We're part of it. We're called to pray for them. We're called to care for them. I find that very difficult. They're out of sight, out of mind. I mean, how many Christians died in Nigeria? I heard 3,000 last year. Nigeria is largely Christian, but there's a lot of Muslims there too. I find it hard to pray. I don't know the stories. So let's pray now. Father in heaven, I thank you that you are with us, that you care for us, that in this life we do have trouble. We don't know what that trouble will look like moving forward, but we know that we ought to take heart because you have overcome the world. Lord, whether we suffer physically or whether we're ostracized as the earliest Christians were from their families, or whether we see people near us or on the other side of the world suffering, teach us to endure to the end. Teach us to love our brothers and sisters around the world, care for them, to know that we're members of the same body. Lord, give us the faith to endure the trials that are before us. Give us the faith to accomplish the works that you have created us for in Christ Jesus, prepared beforehand for us to walk in. In Jesus' name, amen.